Okay, let's get rolling. Well, today's topic is what was the incessant topic last year. Did you follow all the news on Greece all over the last 6 months or so, or 8 months? The conflict, a bit of it. Okay, I was talking a bit about that, but mainly about the overall situation of the euro. But I want to start with a couple of observations that were made on the euro many, many years ago. The first one made back in 1992. Now that's 8 years before the euro began, but it was the date of the release of the document that formed the euro is called the Maastricht Treaty. Have you all heard of the Maastricht Treaty? Okay. Anybody tried reading it? Okay. Not exactly an exciting task. I went through it again looking at it today. Writing this lecture. But Godley wrote a reaction to an article in what's called the London Review of Books, which is still alive and well today, and you can access online. And his conclusion was to say if you have a region that has no power to devalue and it doesn't have fiscal transfers, meaning there's not tax flows to make up for the inability to devalue, then there's nothing stopping it suffering a process of cumulative and terminal decline, leading in the end to emigration as the only alternative to poverty or starvation. And he wrote that in 1992. And I'm sure the reaction of a lot of people who read it was, oh, this guy's an extremist. That's just outrageous. How could anything like it ever happen? Well, if you look at what's happening in southern Europe today, it's precisely that. People literally are leaving the country if they can manage to get away. And it's not just Greece that's depopulating. I went through Croatia earlier this year in a couple of speaking engagements, and there are whole towns in Croatia which are emptying because people are just basically finding it impossible to get work. There's no economic activity, and people of your age and some older are simply leaving and looking for work elsewhere. And you'll find that turning up. If you go to restaurants today in London, you'll find a lot of your the wait staff will be coming from countries like this. So they really, what Godley said could happen back in 1992 is happening on quite a severe scale. Now, Godley died in 2010. He's a leading contributor to what's called post-Keynesian economics. So he's non-orthodox, and politically he'd be seen as left-wing. This guy, Milton Friedman, is the other extreme. Probably the father of monetarism, and a very, very conservative economist who really led the campaign to end what they called Keynesian economics back in the 1970s and 80s. But him writing in 1997 said that the common market that had in Europe at the time before they formed the actual euro was unfavourable to having the common currency. It's that separate nations, where they speak different languages, have different customs and have a far greater loyalty or attachment to their own country, to the common market or to the idea of Europe. So have you all been for trips through Europe, most of you? Okay. You've experienced that, you really have got very, very different cultures. Who's been through a trip through America? Anybody? Okay. The cultures differ, but you can speak the language. Okay. You might find Texans may be rather different to people from New Orleans, but you've got this commonality at least, and a culture commonality as well. And he said despite being a free trade area, goods move less freely than the United States, and so does capital. So he was opposed. So you get one of the leading progressive economists of our time, Godley, and one of the most conservative economists, both agreeing that the euro was a bad idea before it came into existence. Now, if you look at what the state of the European Union is right now in terms of unemployment, it's roughly twice the level that we see in the UK. So this is a chart showing unemployment in England, which is the blue line. You can see that exploded in 2008, went from 5% to about 8%, getting towards 9% of the population. So did the unemployment rate in Europe from a higher level. Now, this includes Germany. Okay, this is the entire, 19 countries that are part of the euro. So including the very low unemployment rate in Germany, the unemployment rates in the rest of the Europe is so high that the unemployment rate in Europe is running about 11 to 12%, which is huge. That's worse than the worst level it reached in America during the crisis, clearly worse than the worst level we reached in England. And you can see that English unemployment started trending down from about 2012. It's now back to almost pre-crisis levels. Not that it'll necessarily continue, but it has improved dramatically. The euro is still going in the wrong direction. So there's something dramatically different about the euro in terms of how it's reacted to the crisis. By the way, I don't know how used you are to going to various websites to find data, but this is one of the best. Ever heard of the St. Louis Fred? if you haven't, FRED stands for Federal Reserve Economic Data. And there's FRED, which is for current data, or they call ALFRED, which is for archive data, archive long-term data. Two very good data sources, and it's got a very nice system for producing graphs as well. It takes a while to get used to it, but you can produce a graph like one I've just shown you there a moment ago fairly easily. So it's a very, very useful resource to know. And they have not just data on America, but as you can see, they've got data on a range of other countries as well. So it's well worth getting used to FRED. Now, if you break down the unemployment, this is data again comes from FRED. I've just had to download it to a spreadsheet to chart it. This is looking at the disaggregated unemployment level. So the black line is American unemployment. Now, again, this crisis was the worst they've had since the Second World War. It doesn't look quite, if you look at the raw numbers, it looks like it was the crisis back in the early 80s was worse with a high level of unemployment. But the definition of unemployment has changed from then to here. If you use the definition that applied back there, you get an unemployment rate here of about 14 or 15%. So it is the worst crisis America's ever experienced since the Great Depression, but it's trending down. You can see that Germany, which is, basically saying to the rest of the Europeans, crisis? What crisis? The only problem is you don't work as hard as us Germans. That type of attitude is developing there. German unemployment's been falling all the way through. It rose a bit when the crisis began, but it's trending down now. It's lower than America. Look at France, however, which is you might regard as being in the middle of the European situation, sitting between Germany at one extreme and the southern European countries at the other. Its unemployment rate is now flatlining at 10-11%. And if you wonder about the conflict you saw in Paris on Friday, then a fair bit of this is you think about where this unemployment is going to be located, which social groups suffer from it, and so on. And that's a large part of why that anger and dissatisfaction is turning up in France. But the real horror stories are Germany, are Spain and Greece. Now, we all know about Greece. It's been in the news all the time. But the Spanish unemployment rate was trending down. It was down towards about 7% of the population when the crisis began. It exploded to 27%. And even though it's started to recover a bit, they're still in the territory that America regarded as the absolute worst of the Great Depression. So those are the unemployment rates they're dealing with there. Now, there's something, and if the Euro countries are the ones that are suffering this way, it's something that's innate to the Euro itself, where the economic outcome has been worse than any country you can name in the rest of the world, even including Ireland in that list with its serious crisis. The Euro, of course, Ireland's part of the Euro, but off the European mainland. But it also affects different countries differently. You've got Germany doing very well, whereas Spain and Greece are in a serious crisis. So it's something specific to the Euro, but something which affects countries within the Eurogroup differently. Now, it was defined by the Maastricht Treaty back in 1992, and if you read that document, you'll find it's a very grand political document. It says the whole idea was to mark a new stage in the process of European integration. So they thought this was bringing Europe together after the conflict of the First and Second World Wars. End the division of the European continent, deepen the solidarity between peoples who are respecting their history, culture and traditions, achieve the strengthening, and notice this convergence of their economies. Now, clearly they're diverging. They were converging for a while, but the unemployment rates have massively diverged, falling unemployment in Germany and Austria and places like that, the Netherlands, rising unemployment in the rest of Europe. And to establish an economic and monetary union, including a single and stable currency. Now notice, can anybody tell me a word that's missing from there you might expect to see in that phrase? An economic and monetary union. What other sort of union might you imagine having? Pardon? Political? That's sort of, the political's there because this is politically drafted. It's an economic term. Pardon? Fiscal, absolutely. There's no mention of fiscal there. Okay? So they've left off one of the two ways you unite an area is not just to have a shared monetary policy and shared currency, but also to have a shared treasury. Okay? So taxation, in other words, the taxation you are paying in England goes to the whole of the United Kingdom. Okay? So if you're paying tax here, then part of your tax money may well be being spent in Scotland, in Wales and Ireland. You don't even think about it. Okay? There's a union because we all pay to the same taxation authority, and that then distributes spending as well from the same authority. That wasn't part of the plan with the euro. Now, it replaced almost 20 national currencies, which meant they could no longer devalue against each other. So if you had a trade imbalance back in the 1990s, if Germany was exporting more to Greece than vice versa, so Greece had a serious trade deficit with Germany, with the rest of the world, then the German drachma could drop in value. That would therefore make imports from Germany more expensive. It would make holidays in Greece cheaper. It would have a negative impact on the balance of trade initially through what's called the J curve. If you search, anybody heard of what's called the J curve? Okay. Basically an argument saying if you make an immediate adjustment to prices by a change in the exchange rate, then initially there's no change to quantity, so you get a drop in revenue. But then because you've made yourself cheaper, your volume should rise over time and you get an improvement later on. That's part of the concept behind how devaluations work. But clearly a devaluation was, whether it's done by deliberate policy when you had fixed exchange rates, whether it's done by the market, that can partially reduce the impact of massive trade imbalances. That obviously don't get rid of them because we've still got massive trade imbalances in a period of floating exchange rates, but it is another way of adjusting your economy if something goes wrong. Now, the purpose was to promote economic growth and stability, and here you'll see some of the statements inside the Maastricht Treaty. The community shall, by establishing a common market and economic and monetary union, not including fiscal, and implementing common policies, it's to promote a harmonious and balanced development of economic activities, sustainable and non-inflationary growth, respecting the environment, a high degree of economic convergence, convergence of economic performance, and a high level of employment and social protection. How do you reckon it's doing so far? Okay. It was doing fine in the early years. It all fell apart in 2008, and now it's doing disastrously on all those principles that are supposed to be behind it. Raise the standard of living and quality of life? Well, not so crash hot for Southern Europe on that front. Economic and social cohesion and solidarity amongst member states. It's certainly now that for a while, but I think it's now the major force causing division in Europe. And its overarching concerns would, and this is where you start to see what is the philosophy. These are the objectives. What's the economic philosophy behind it? What do they see as the way one achieves these outcomes? And their argument was the most important thing was to avoid large government deficits. So not only did they not mention the idea of a common fiscal policy, the objective was to reduce the power of each individual nation to exercise fiscal policy in the first place. And they wanted to achieve price stability and low inflation. That was the major objective. Which country does it sound like had a major hand in drafting this, being opposed? Yeah, Germany. With the obsession of the Weimar Republic in their history, terrified of hyperinflation. So their objective is always to try to reduce inflation. They said that is the key way of achieving economic stability. Now here's an explicit statement in the document. Member states shall avoid excessive government deficits. So it's really saying government deficits is the major cause of economic problems. So if they avoid large government deficits, everything's going to be wonderful. And they were defined in an appendix as the deficit being 3% or above the percent of GDP in any 1 year. So that was seen as excessive. And equally, having an accumulated debt level of more than 60% of GDP was also seen as having excessive government deficits. And there were on the basis of that, Brussels could then impose controls and fines and so on national governments. And we've seen in the last 8 months, or 10 months now, just how brutally they can be imposed. I don't know how much you followed what was happening with Greece, but the Greek government completely lost its sovereignty to Brussels. Everything had to be approved by Brussels, and they would finish this at Friday night, and the meeting finished at 1 o'clock in the morning on Friday night, and you're supposed to submit a revised proposal at 9 o'clock in the morning on Monday. They gave them absolutely no independence or time to get done what they thought was what the Euro said was necessary to so-called solve their situation. A monetary policy said the primary objective of the European system of central banks, that's what ESCB stands for, shall be to maintain price stability. So the beliefs you have, if you can actually summarise it this way, this is my paraphrasing rather than a statement in the document. But it's pretty much the argument, if you can constrain government spending and achieve price stability, then you'll get economic stability as well. That's the thought there. Now, despite the fact that this is an economic treaty, almost from the outset you find it being criticised by economists, and not just the non-conventional mob that I'm part of. Of course, as I've shown, you've got Milton Friedman as well. So you all know who Milton Friedman is? Are you familiar? Okay, I'll just give you a bit of a reminder for those who don't know. For a start, if you didn't think he was conservative, the fact that he was this woman's favourite economist might give you an idea of how conservative he is. So this is Maggie Thatcher, and apparently Maggie used to carry a copy of Hayek's, I forgot which book, I think it was The Road to Serfdom she had in her handbag at all times. But if she had any other book, she would have had a copy of Milton's as well, and you can see that final statement there, revive the economics of liberty. Now, he critiqued the idea of the euro, so he's saying that the main motivation, and this is quite true, was political. People who were forming the euro were motivated by trying to avoid the horrors of the First and Second World War. That just, they were European wars, which involved the entire globe. And of course, Germany and France were two of the major protagonists. So the idea of the euro is try to bond them so closely that you couldn't get a war between those two countries anymore. Now, I think the idea of a war is unthinkable still. But I know. But conflict, that's not unthinkable. And Milton Friedman's comment here is he believed the adoption of the euro will have the opposite effect. So rather than linking them more closely and reducing the possibility for conflict, Friedman was saying it's likely to increase the possibility of conflict. And he said it will exacerbate tensions by converting divergent shocks, and clearly you can see what happened in 2008 as a shock having different effects on different countries, that could have been readily accommodated by exchange rate changes into divisive political issues. And he said, and that's clearly what we've seen if you look at the Greece versus German conflict, that could all have been resolved if Germany didn't like the economic policy or the situation that Greece was in. If they didn't have the same currency, the Greece currency would have plummeted in value. Now, it would have meant they couldn't pay their debts either, because their debts were denominated in euro, but it would have all been over fairly rapidly with a massive currency depreciation by the drachma. So political unity can pave the way for monetary unity, but if you impose monetary unity under unfavourable conditions, which is clearly what happened, that'll cause a barrier to political unity. So the prospects, I think, of any further unity in Europe now are just out the window. So he said, you have currency union means you have a loss of capacity to vary your exchange rates, and flexible exchange rates, even though they're not, when we first went to flexible exchange rates in the early 1970s, most conventional economists believed that would be the end of trade imbalances between countries, because according to their theory, the exchange rates would adjust for differences in exports and imports, and therefore all countries run balanced trade. Well, that's been clearly wrong. Okay? It hasn't happened like that. But if you have a fixed exchange rate in that situation where you're tied to another country's economy, then you can even worse forces come out. So they haven't been a solution. Like in that sense, they might regard them as a prophylactic, something that reduces the pain of an illness, but not a cure. Well, you weren't even allowed to reduce the pain of the illness caused by a huge shock like the 2008 financial crisis. That it's only worth dispensing with getting a single currency if there are alternative adjustment mechanisms available. Now, of course, one advantage of the euro is, of course, you go to one European country, you take a euro out of the bank, you go to another European country, you use the same notes. Okay? So in that sense, transaction costs, and tourists love them for that reason. You're not losing money on the borders exchanging dollars for lira and then dollars for drachma and so on, and having leftover lira you can't spend, etc., etc. So it has an appeal at the personal level, but at the social level it means that if anything goes wrong, you don't have one of the means you would normally use to try to adjust for things going wrong. Now, the USA has those mechanisms, and he said this writing back in the 1990s, so looking back at what happened in the 70s and 80s, you can have a shock which affects one part of the US more than it does others. And his nomination was the embargo on oil back in the 1970s. So you don't remember much, you know, your economic history on the front. If you're aware of what are called the oil crises of the early 70s? Okay. In 1973, first of all, the Organisation of Petroleum Exporting Countries was formed. And at that stage, the price of a barrel of oil was $2.50. And that all the oil was owned by what they called the Seven Sisters, who were the 7 major Western-owned multinational corporations who owned all the well rigs in all the places where oil was mined. Now, initially, oil mining began in Texas. That wasn't such a problem, but of course moved to the Middle East. And what it meant was that they were paying a very low amount of money to the Middle East governments, taking out the profits. So what OPEC did initially was increase the price of oil from $2.50 a barrel to $10. That was in 1973-74, I think. And then in 79, another crisis ensued, and the price rose from $10 a barrel to $40. Do you know what the rough price of oil is today? It's about 40. Okay, reached 120, 130 a couple of years ago. It's since crashed from that level. But that was an incredible impact upon America, because it meant that people who were importing, states that are importing oil, were saying in the first case 4 times, and at the end of the year, end of the decade, up to 16 times what they did for oil before the crisis. But Texas, where you were getting low revenues because the prices you got as an oil producer in Texas were affected by the international market, they increased by a factor of 4 first of all, and then a factor of 16. So Texas got a boom, the rest of the country got a slump. And Milton Friedman's point was that these effects were mediated by 2 things. People and goods can move around, so there's a shift of people from what they call the Rust Belt in America down towards the Sunshine States. But also, the government was paying more dole checks in the Rust Belt and collecting more tax in the Sunshine States. So the fiscal adjustments meant that the shock wasn't, even though it did hit regions differently, there was some attenuation of how severe that downturn was. Now, the euro has the first and the third mechanism, in the sense that people can move from one country to another, and there can be adjustments to prices and wages, but there's no offsetting financial flow. If something hits Greece and reduces Greece's revenue, there's no fiscal transfer from the rest of the euro to make up for that, because Greece collects its own tax, does its own government spending. It doesn't get any real benefit from the European Union itself. Do you have any idea what the debt level of the European Commission is as a percentage of Europe's GDP? It's about 1%. In other words, the amount of money that's been borrowed or issued as bonds by the European authorities in Brussels to manage what it does, the European Parliament and their police forces and stuff like that, it's literally 1% of GDP, whereas the debt level typically for national economies like America is between 50 and 90% of GDP. So it gives you an idea how small the actual fiscal centre of the European Union is, but of course it's politically extremely powerful. So you have, it's back to Friedman's argument, wages and prices are more rigid, labour's less mobile, even though people do move between countries now with what they call the Schengen Agreement. You've got to learn a new language when you move somewhere. It's very, very difficult to make those moves. So you don't have that useful adjustment of the offsetting financial flows. And what you have effectively is you can regard the nations of Europe that are part of the euro as being a bit like the states in the United States of America. But of course US states have relatively tiny budgets, whereas the federal has a huge budget. In Europe, the central budget is tiny. It just administers what goes on in Brussels and the... Yeah. Well, you do have movements of goods and certain people around Europe, so people can move from one country to another. Okay. And you can have adjustments of prices and wages. That can happen too. So what's actually the main adjustment mechanism that's applying in Greece right now is people's wages are dropping. Okay. So wages are getting cheaper in Greece, which means the cost of being a tourist in Greece is also dropping. That's about the only adjustment mechanism they've got, but it's not as strong as you have in America either. There's more flexibility of wages and prices, and there's more capacity for an American to move from one state to another. Okay? So also the important point that Friedman's making there is that the Federal Reserve, when you have a shock like the increase in oil prices back in the 70s, then that oil price is going to rise, is going to boost employment in Texas. It'll reduce it in Ohio, which is one of the old industrial states, which means the taxes will rise and welfare spending will fall in Texas. So in that sense, Texas may be a net contributor now to the federal budget, whereas before the oil price rise it might have been a net recipient of funds from the federal budget. On the other hand, taxes will fall and welfare spending will rise in Ohio. So Ohio might have been a net contributor, now it's going to be a net recipient. All that stuff means that there's an evening out of the impact of the shock on the whole of America by these transfers from one state to another, which nobody even thinks about. For example, do you know what the California's trade deficit is? Neither does California. Okay? You don't even think about it. But of course we do think about this in the case of the states in Europe. So in addition to that, as well as having no transfers, the amount that be done within each of these states is also constrained by the 60% and 3% rules. So in that sense, what the euro does, it sets up an endogenous shock. Shocks are normally seen as being something that comes from outside your system. So if you talk about an exogenous shock, as Friedman did just then, he's using it very well because he was saying the oil price rise, which affected things inside America, was due to the politics of the Middle East. Okay, that's genuinely an exogenous shock. It's a good example of one. But in this case, what you have is almost endogenous because you have a free flow of goods between countries, relatively speaking, and a free flow of private finance. So it's quite possible for French and German banks to lend to Greek and Spanish businesses. Okay? But Germany at the same time is exporting much more than it does to Greece. Okay, German exports to Greece are much bigger than Greek exports to Germany. And the euro says, well, you can't devalue to try to reduce your imports or increase your exports. And you can't run a monetary policy to vary the imports. You can't have high interest rates in Greece because interest rates are set for the whole of Europe. So those two mechanisms which have been removed. And you can't run government deficits either. Okay? So in a sense, the euro was a straitjacket. It removed any of the flexibility you'd normally want to have for running a national economy. And you can borrow money. This is the curious one. You can borrow money. So the private transfers of money were facilitated by the euro, but everything else was prevented. So what do you think happened? And this is what the euro completely ignored. Pardon? They borrowed like crazy. And what you get is, first of all, an explosion in trade deficits. So this is this is data taken from the Fred database. So I just mentioned earlier for the people who arrived a bit late here, there's a fantastic database called Fred, which is the Federal Reserve Economic Database maintained by the St. Louis Fred. So you can find all this sort of data here, very useful for both illustrating your essays and also for understanding what's going on. So you can see I've plotted Germany here, and you can see Germany had a trade surplus, then a trade deficit, then a trade surplus again, then a bit of a trade deficit starting in the early 1990s, getting slightly worse until the euro formed. And then its trade surplus is now running at about 7% of GDP, which is one of the biggest in percentage terms in the world and one of the biggest in absolute terms in the world as well. On the other hand, Spain, which was running a pretty much balanced budget in 95, had started having a trade deficit of about 5% of GDP when the euro began, but that plunged down to over 10% of GDP. Now that's a huge trade deficit. Greece, even worse. Greece was running a trade deficit of the order of 3 to 5% of GDP, which would normally give you pressure to devalue anyway. Once the euro came in, it hit 15%. So enormous imbalances there. Overall, this is the dotted, the grey line in the middle there, overall the euro group as a whole, when you aggregate all those countries together, has a relatively balanced trade pattern with the rest of the world.
Why did it rise in Greece?
Pardon?
Why did it rise in Spain, Greece and Croatia?
Because they're importing from Germany, fundamentally. Okay. Suddenly, what would have happened in the past is German cars would have got more expensive over time because the drachma would have dropped in value, so you wouldn't have bought as many German cars. You wouldn't have you wouldn't have bought German capital equipment, etc., etc. So with the euro being fixed, those exchange rate changes which did happen before the euro ceased at that point, and then this huge imbalance develops. One little illustration I can give you of the combination of things, the naivety of people who are involved in making these policies. I got involved in an argument with one of the economists at the European Union about three or 4 years ago on this whole issue, and he said, look, it's just the case that Greece has to become more competitive. That was his argument. And I said, but if you look at the history of innovation in Germany and Greece, Germany produces about 20 times as many patents per head as Greece does. When you look literally at the level of innovations which are registered as new technologies by Greek companies versus German companies, Germany's always been registering 10, 20 times as many as Greece. How do you expect Greece to suddenly start developing the industrial structure to produce that many patents per year? He said, even if you get them to match now, they're going to diverge over time unless you can turn Greece into Germany. And he hadn't even thought of that. Okay. They are thinking in a very static world where they don't actually consider the dynamic forces that cause divergences over time. So this one would not have happened without the euro. That scale of... So the euro's were the reason why Germany's running such huge trade surpluses. Now, so they can't... Spain and Europe and Greece can't devalue against the German mark because it doesn't exist anymore. In the past, they could have run a larger budget deficit, and the budget deficit could have reduced the impact on the economy of the bad trade balance with its own issues over time, but it could have done so. They can't do that either without breaking the Maastricht rules. So what you get at the Maastricht rules is the European Central Bank is effectively required to underwrite a deficit of up to 3% of GDP. So if you have a government budget and it works out you're going to run a deficit of, say, 10% of GDP, then the European Central Bank, you will have to issue bonds to finance that. So you issue the bonds and you sell the bonds into the private sector, which means banks and pension funds buy the bonds. But if you don't sell any of the bonds, the European Central Bank is required to buy 3% of them, relative 3% of GDP. But the other 7% you're on your own. Now what that means is, to actually sell those bonds, you've got to drop the price. So what you get out of the dropping the price is a huge increase in the interest rates. And what you see in the data is this gigantic increase in interest rates because of that need to finance your budget deficit by selling bonds to the private sector. Now, this whole problem about the fiscal controls on the Maastricht, on the European governments in the Maastricht Treaty was what Godley focused upon. And this is his article from the London Review of Books. By the way, when I put these on the website, if you click on this, you'll go to the actual article. So I've got them all linked in there, and you can see the paper. I think this has to go down as probably the most prescient article written in economics, written back in 1992. Remarkable piece of writing. So do have a look at that. Now, what he said was, because the treaty proposes no institution other than a bank, its sponsors have to believe that nothing more is needed. But that could only be correct if modern economies were self-adjusting systems that didn't need management at all. And here's the different perspective that he's coming to it from Friedman. Friedman did believe that economies were self-adjusting, but saw the exchange rate as part of that adjustment mechanism. So saying, why get rid of a mechanism that helps you adjust? What Godley is saying is the economies don't self-adjust. So there's going to be a crisis. In other words, his expectation, unlike Friedman's, was saying, since the economies aren't self-adjusting, there will be a crisis, and when this crisis comes along, the euro will make that crisis worse. So he said, any country that joins the euro effectively becomes like a local authority, like a local council. And just like a local council can't run a sustained deficit, nor can a government under the euro, and nor can they devalue. You can't suddenly... Does anybody been to Brixton? Have you got a Brixton pound? Have you seen the Brixton pound? Okay. Brixton has produced a community currency. So they do actually have a currency you can buy in Brixton that's not the English pound. So that it is possible to have that. But generally speaking, local councils don't have anything that's their own monetary system. They can't do it. So he said not only do they lose the value to devalue, they also lose the power to finance deficits through money creation. And I'll talk a bit about that in later lectures when I start talking about austerity in one of the later lectures in this series. So, as he's saying, then do take note of that argument. He's effectively saying the government can create money by running a deficit. Now, if you don't have that power, then part of your money creation power in an economy has been removed as well by the Maastricht Treaty. And that was his main focus. What happens if an entire country suffers a structural setback? Well, as long as it's a sovereign state, it can devalue. And it can trade, hopefully at full employment, by reducing the value of its currency, because having done that reduction in currency, your effective income level has fallen compared to the rest of the world. So with an economic and monetary union, you can't do it. And that's going to be grave unless you can have federal budgetary arrangements that help you fix that up. The transfers, like I was talking earlier, between Texas and Ohio. Now, if you have no power to devalue, and you're not the beneficiary of that sort of fiscal transfer either, they said there's nothing to stop you suffering a cumulative decline, leading to emigration as the only alternative to poverty and starvation. Now imagine just think about the personal courage it takes to write something like that in the 1990s. Okay? Remarkable man. Now this is what's happened to Southern Europe, because the euro was dominated by the belief that modern economies were self-adjusting. And the person who gave us this idea was an American economist called Robert Barrow. Ever heard of what's called Ricardian equivalence? You haven't? Oh, good. Okay. Well, always be worried when an economist dresses his ideas up in the name of an economist he hasn't read. And I don't know for sure that Barrow hasn't read Ricardo, but he certainly hasn't read all of Ricardo. So he wrote a paper back in 1989, just a short time before the Maastricht Treaty was signed, called the Ricardian approach to budget deficits. Now, I'm not saying that this was picked up and used as the blueprint, for the euro, but it's so close to the thinking that dominated the euro that he can say that was the case. Because again, the euro was drafted by economists, fundamental economists and bankers. So the vision that economists and bankers have for how the world operates is what's embedded there, and this really is the vision that lies behind the euro. Now, he argued that a budget deficit doesn't actually stimulate the economy. So part of Godley's argument was that if there's a downturn in private spending, a budget deficit can compensate that by an increase in spending by the state. And what Barrow was saying, no, if there's a budget deficit, that will be offset by an identical reduction in private spending, so that a budget deficit doesn't stimulate demand, and therefore the best situation is to have a balanced budget. You heard that one before? This is the basis of Ricardian equivalence. Now, one reason that when I teach any course, I really recommend you to go back and read the original papers. Don't rely upon a textbook. Okay? Read. If you find somebody's quoting in a textbook, quoting an author, find the author, find the paper. If you take a topic, go searching in the journals using, what's it called, ICAT, isn't it, here at Kingston? Use ICAT and find the reference and see what they've got to say. And don't be intimidated by any mathematics in there. If you can't read the maths, just read around the maths. Because if an academic has written an article and it's been through the refereeing and editing process of a journal, then the text will explain what the equations are talking about anyway, most of the time. Very, very rarely will you ever see an article where they say, given this, therefore, and the statement's a piece of mathematics. They'll put the mathematics in and they'll explain what it means verbally around it. So you can read that stuff. Don't be intimidated by seeing a mass of equations in an academic paper. But Barrow argued this logic, is that a deficit financed by cutting current taxes leads to higher future taxes that have the same present value as the initial cut. So he's hypothesising that over time, the net present value of a government deficit must be zero. Okay? You've got a discount for budgets in the future. He's saying, looking forward, the government's always got to have a balanced budget. That's his initial assumption. He said this result follows from the government's budget constraint. He said the budget is given by its revenues, which come from taxation, and its net and its expenditure is financed out of that taxation. So saying the government must tax in order to be able to spend. Think about that. I'm going to come back to that when I talk about austerity. Is that a sensible proposition? But the first proposition is the government's budget must be balanced throughout time, and this follows from a budget constraint which says that the government must tax to bring in revenue so it can spend. Okay? Think about those concepts. Are they sound? With that logic, he then said, now notice this thing I've got involved. Suppose now that household demands for goods depend upon expected present future value of taxes. So your consumption decisions depend upon what you expect taxes to be in the future. That sounds sensible to you? Whenever you see an economist saying the word suppose or let's assume, substitute the word let's pretend. Okay? It makes a lot more sense. This is a fantasy. Okay? I don't think about my present view. I don't even think about my current taxes when I go shopping. Think about it. It's suggesting a level of you thinking about the future that's absurd in the real world. But let's get worse than this. He said that is, each household subtracts its share of this present value of taxes from what it expects to get in income to work out what its current net wealth, and then it spends out of its current net wealth after it's taken account of what it expects taxes to be in the future. And then fiscal policy will only affect aggregate demand in this situation if people expected the value of taxes to fall over time. But he said, in fact, the preceding argument that he'd given about government revenue being a balanced budget over time, that's not going to happen. We're assuming that's not going to change. He said, therefore, a budget deficit has no impact upon aggregate demand for goods. Because what happens is the government spends more money with a budget deficit. You then know that's going to mean you've got to pay more taxes in the future. So you set aside an amount of money out of your current income to pay those future taxes, and you spend less now, and your reduction in spending perfectly offsets the government's increase in spending. What does that sound like to you? Think about it. Okay. Now I want to show, if you're all sceptical about it, I want to show you a good reason to be sceptical. Because Barrow then considered 5 objections to his argument, but I think the first one's the best one. Okay. He said there's 5 major objections, and the first is that people don't live forever. Now if you think about it, what he's saying is if you expect taxes to go up in the future, so you're going to spend less now, wouldn't that only happen if you expected to be alive in the future? What if you thought the tax is going to be levied in a century's time? Would you put money aside in a century's time? According to him, you would. He said, the argument fails that the typical person is already getting to his or her children out of altruism. Now, who's living with their parents? Anybody? Okay, the parents are still covering your costs. They'll whinge about it all the time, I'm sure. No, that's good. That's good. But they are covering you in that sense. But are they covering your great-grandchildren? Are they covering your great-grandchildren as well? He argues they are. He said, in this case, people react to government's imposed intergenerational transfers. So he sees having a budget surplus deficit now as taking money from the future, which is a transfer from the future to now. He said they make a compensating increase in voluntary transfers. So the main idea is a network. Now this is real. He wrote this stuff. This is published in an academic journal. Okay. The idea is the network of intergenerational transfers makes the typical person a part of an extended family that goes on indefinitely. So your parents are supposed to be putting aside money not just for your education now, but if the government's running a deficit, they're putting money aside in the future so your great-great-grandchildren, your own children, can pay the taxes in 233 years' time. He says, in this setting, households capitalise the entire array of expected taxes and therefore effectively plan with an infinite horizon. You reckon your parents are planning with an infinite horizon, or are they trying to get through to Christmas? Okay. They said, no, I think I'd like to use a piece of Australian French here to describe this. Okay. This is what a bull drops out. The fact that this stuff is accepted shows how bizarre economics is. So they'll let nonsense like this get published. They get rid of the cow. But that's really what's lying behind the belief you shouldn't run a budget deficit. If you argued with an economist over this in the European Union, and they were part of the conventional people that put this stuff together, and you argue that, well, fiscal transfers are not possible, you don't understand Ricardian equivalence. Well, I used to say, excuse me, but I think I do. It's you don't understand the real world. So in the aftermath of that crisis, we now have 2 competing perspectives. And this is the dominant one, is one I've shown you a moment ago, that the whole problem is government deficits. Again, if you look what's happened in political debate in England, Cameron and, Osborne, pushed the line at the crisis back in 2008 was used Labour spending. Okay? They blamed the crisis on Labour. And so government spending is seen as, you have to reduce government spending, what they call fiscal consolidation, to restore confidence. Now, the alternative perspective comes from, of course, Yanis Varoufakis. That links to Yanis's blog. The post-Keynesian group, and even a lot of new Keynesians like Paul Krugman, agree on the same front, that there was some different cause. The crisis was preceded, crisis itself preceded rising public debt. And I'll show you the timing of that in the second half of the lecture. But it was amplified by the Maastricht rules, which prevented the government deficit rising as much as it would do in a country that didn't have these rules imposed upon it. And the dominant perspective is best put by the German Minister of Finance, Wolfgang Schäuble. Did I get the pronunciation right? I used to really mangle the pronunciation. I think I'm getting a bit closer to it these days. So he wrote a paper in the New York Times, and that again you can link to that. I do have a read of that article. And he argued there, and I think this is a beautiful opening line, as in medicine, to prescribe the right treatment it is essential to have the correct diagnosis. So what's his diagnosis? He says, the crisis was first and foremost a crisis of confidence, rooted in structural shortcomings. So investors realised that the member countries of the Euro were not as competitive or reliable as the uniform bond yields of the previous years implied. I'll show you that chart in a moment. But if you look at interest rates, which are being charged by the interest rates governments had to pay on their bonds, they all converged when the euro began. Germany was much cheaper before the euro started. It might have paid, say, 5% in its bonds, whereas Portugal or Spain would pay 10%. Then they all converged to 4%, fell to about 2%, and then complete explosion after the crisis began. So he blames this convergence of rates beforehand, and then people realising they shouldn't be. That's what he thinks caused the crisis. So he then said what happens was investors began to treat the bonds of certain countries, i.e. Greece and Spain, to some extent Italy, more caution, which made interest rates rise. So the way interest rates rise with bonds is when you try to sell the bond, you have to accept a lower price for it, and therefore the yield rises in that sense. There's an inverse relationship between interest rates and the price of bonds. The cure is to rebuild trust. Okay? So he saw as essential. And he said simply spending more public money would not have done the trick, nor can it now. So he's ruling out any possibility of fiscal transfers fixing things up. He said Germany has consistently advocated structural reform. So you deregulate labour markets, you privatise public institutions, all of which is being done in Greece on a grand scale now, and you reduce public debt without throttling growth. Now, question, do you think that growth is being throttled in Europe? I can't think of any way to describe it. He said it's not blind austerity, it's setting a reliable framework for private sector activity, preparing ageing societies for the future, and improving the quality of public budgets. So his whole thing about the most important thing is to get the government deficit down, and that's the entire focus of the policy. He says it's worked in Germany. Okay? See, what he's really saying is if Germany can do it, why can't you? And that tends to be a very strong argument for very weak reasons in a political debate like this. And then what he said, what we're doing, well, we're speeding up debt reduction, reducing deficits in good times to increase them in bad times. So it's seeing this balanced around zero argument for what deficit should be. And he said we're going to have modernisation and improvements to regulation. Stimulus is not part of the plan. Now that's clearly what's been imposed on Greece. We've seen that very brutally this year. So what he's blaming the crisis on is Greek debt being priced wrongly at the same price as German debt during the boom, and then Greek rates explode during the crisis, and his solution is to restore confidence by reducing government debt. And he believes this will reduce that huge gap and make the gap more realistic. To give you an idea of the scale of the gap, we'll take a break after that for middle half of the lecture. This shows you what spreads are like. So that you can guess that's Greek debt before the crisis. 2000 is when the euro came in, and you can see all the rates converged. The German interest rate is the red one here. They all converged from 2000 right through to 2008, and then look what happens to the cost of Greek debt. Okay. Also, Spanish debt rose a substantial degree. You still had continuing falling rates for France and for some other countries inside the euro. But that's his explanation as to where the crisis came from. Let's take a break there. I've got to get some of my fluid for my voice. My voice is cracking. So come back in about 10 minutes' time, the second half of the lecture. That's starting to record. Okay, so that's the situation for the interest rates. Let's go a bit deeper. Whoa, hang on, what happened there? I clicked on the wrong button. Okay, click over here. Right. Okay. So that's Schwabel's explanation, if you think about it, is European-centric. It says the whole crisis was a European crisis, and it was caused by investors wrongly pricing the bonds of different countries. That's the argument you can see being put forward by Schäuble. The alternative perspective is it's exactly the same crisis we've seen around the entire world. The American crisis, the Irish crisis, etc., they're all the same basic crisis. And what America did was, in a sense, respond successfully to that crisis because government spending rose dramatically. It went into a huge deficit when the crisis hit. And they also had discretionary policies like what's called cash for clunkers. Have you heard of that one? In 2009, when Obama became president, one of the things they put forward is they would give you money to return your old car. So the idea was you have a clunker of a car, an old gas-guzzling monster, and you could swap it for a hybrid. Okay, you got government money to help you do that. So all this money was injected into the economy. They have what's called TARP, and I've forgotten what TARP stands for, but that was $700 billion. Remember that song I played last week, the monster crash? Okay, that's what they refer to as TARP there. And that's the Targeted Asset Repurchasing Program, I think TARP stands for. 700? Huh? Sorry? Hank Paulson, that's right, it was Hank Paulson's idea. It didn't go where Hank Paulson said the money would go, but that's another story. And quantitative easing, so large-scale federal government, Federal Reserve buying. Now, ultimately the euro has done quantitative easing, which goes against its principles, but it didn't do any of the others because there was no treasury for the European economy to respond this way. And then austerity was imposed by Brussels, which meant cut to government's programs, which are directly intended to reduce the government debt to GDP ratio. Now, I don't have detail on the actual cuts. You can actually look and see some of the documents that the European Union forced the Greeks to go into. But to give you an example, over 90% of Greeks who lose their jobs don't get unemployment benefits. Okay. Not that they've been, and pensions have been cut by 25 and 30%. So severe cuts to government spending have been brought in. Now what actually happened was, even though these were intended to reduce the government debt to GDP ratio, the ratios often fell because government spending fell, but GDP fell even more. So if you take a look at the data on this, you'll see a serious downturn coming out of directly trying to reduce government debt and seeing that as the problem. So Varoufakis' argument was there are four interrelated problems. There's a banking crisis, and you see this notice, it's a common global banking crisis, sparked off mainly by the catastrophe in American finance. But Europe's been unequal to deal with it because of the structure and governance of the euro. A central bank with no government, a national government with no central bank. And they're arrayed against global banks that have got far more power in that sense and flexibility than they have. A debt crisis. Now, what he's talking about here is the government debt crisis. Because what was really argued was we come together in the currency, but on debts you're on your own. Each country has to finance its own debts, its own government spending. An investment crisis. So Germany ran large surpluses after 2000, but the trade imbalances that occurred because of this huge investment by Germany and huge export surplus by Germany meant the deficit countries would collapse. They needed investment, they weren't going to get it, and finally a social crisis. And this is, has anybody here been on a holiday in Greece or Spain recently? What are your impressions? Pardon? Didn't feel, because you're being a tourist here, you don't necessarily about your own. You pick up anything? Really cheap. Things are cheaper to buy. And what you might not notice, any restaurant you go to is going to be full. Check and see what's happened to the neighbouring restaurants. I went to where was that? Slovenia, I think. But I went to a very fancy restaurant, absolutely full of people. I walked past 5 empty restaurants to get to it that all been shut down. So you don't actually see it when you go to a venue, but it's the venues that aren't operating that occur. I went for a trip through Greece. I was giving talks in Athens and also in a town called Thessalonica, which is the second major capital in Greece. And we were driving on a Friday night on a 6-lane highway, maybe in 8 lanes actually, and we were the only car at the toll booth in either direction on a Friday night between the 2 biggest cities in Greece. So it's not what you see, it's what you don't see. Okay? That's what you've got to look to see this sort of stuff. But it's a huge social crisis. And you'll find people throughout southern Europe now trying to find jobs in northern Europe. So you've got 2 very different perspectives there. Okay, one blames the government deficits for the whole problem and says fiscal consolidation is needed. The other said it's an independent problem and the government system has made things worse. Well, let's just take a look at a bit of the data here. And I'll always emphasise, check the data. Economists are great at saying they're data-driven and they ignore the data when it doesn't suit their theories. Now, if the design of the euro is correct, if the whole idea about avoiding government deficits and keeping inflation low was the important way to succeed, then the country that did that the best would actually succeed, be the most successful country in Europe. So the government deficit had to be under 3% of GDP per year, and government debt had to be less than 60% of GDP. So which countries do you think actually reached those criteria? Germany. Okay, any others? Austria. Okay, any other guesses? Okay, well, here are my choices. Who's going to put their hands up for Germany? No? Okay, yeah, quite okay. What about France? What do you reckon, France? No. Okay. Italy? No. Spain? No. Greece? Yeah. It's not quite that bad. Correct answer is Spain. The only country that met the criteria was Spain. The only country to have a government debt to GDP ratio of less than 60% and deficits of below 3%. In fact, it was running a surplus for the final period of the crisis, or the final period before the crisis began. Germany's government debt ratio has almost always been above 60%. So it's broken its own rules. And Italy's government, even though we focus upon how bad Greece is and how terrible, yada, 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 and how it deserves to be punished, etc., Italy, throughout the whole period, had a higher ratio of government debt to GDP than Greece did, and only during the crisis did Greece's debt exceed it. So there's the data. So as you can see here, let's take a look at the biggest culprit. There's Germany. Now Germany, for a short while, had a debt level below 60% of GDP, but since 2003, its debt level has been above the maximum set by the policy. Here you have Greece, and we all focus upon Greece, but look at this, all the way through, that was below Italy's level. And then you have the austerity strikes, and what happens during austerity? Well, austerity is supposed to reduce Greece's debt to GDP ratio. Look what happens after it explodes. Most of the increase in Greece's ratio occurred after the austerity program brought in by the European Union was forced upon it. So we blame the Greeks for this, but in fact that whole period was when the Europeans were in control. And notice Italy's level's been rising all the way through, so these days they're a head's breadth apart. Now, when's the last time you saw somebody from the European Union criticise Italy? Okay? Why do you think they don't criticise Italy? Check and see who the Prime Minister is. He's a European bureaucrat. Okay? There's a lot of politics tied up in this. And also that's the 60% of GDP as a debt rule. What about the 3% rule? Well, here are the deficits over time. And notice Germany, the red line, the target is 3%, which is this tiny dotted line here, you can just see it. And for a substantial period, Germany's been above it even before the crisis began. When the crisis hit, its deficit hit 10% of GDP. It's now back down again towards zero, below the Maastricht level. But for substantial periods, it broke the rules. Spain is the only country throughout the whole period that was below the 3% level. There's the 3% target. Here's only once has it even come close, a couple of times it came close to 3% deficit. So if the theory was right of the Maastricht Treaty, Spain would be the best performing country in Europe and Germany would be one of the basket cases. Okay? So it's actually the theory that's the basket case and not the countries. And let's take another close look again. I'm going to compare Germany and Spain more closely here. And you can see Germany broke the rules between 2003 and 2005, and then it really broke the rules when the crisis began. Now Spain, all the way through, before the crisis hit, was having a government deficit well below the 3% level, and quite frequently it was running a surplus. Look, from 2000 and halfway through 2006, all the way pretty much to 2009, it was running a surplus. So there's something very wrong with the theory that says that's going to lead to success, because what happened to the economy? A total collapse. Now, also, you'll see Schäuble trumpeting Ireland and Spain as examples of countries that did the reforms and did what was required and have now got the highest growth rates in the country. Well, maybe it's because they've got enormous deficits. Spain's debt increase of this period, in terms of GDP, the increase in government debt to GDP, hit as high as 20% of GDP at this point up here. And it's still running a deficit at about 12% of GDP. I'm not criticising it running a deficit that large. I'm simply saying the European Union is not imposing its rules on that country or Italy right now. Now, it may well, but that'll be a political decision to do it. It won't be economically sensible reasons behind why it gets done. Now, if you look at Spanish GDP, why has the ratio risen, government debt risen so much? Well, what you see, this is also, I often use ratios, ratio of private debt to GDP to make an argument, but frequently you can have a rising ratio when the level of the debt's actually falling, because the denominator is falling faster than the numerator in that sense. So I've separated the two out here, and what you can see is that all the way through the boom period, GDP and Spanish GDP was growing very smoothly. Government debt was remaining constant, and therefore it was falling as a proportion of GDP, not so much because they were actually cutting debt, though they were on various occasions, but because debt was remaining constant while GDP was growing. Then the crisis hits, GDP is actually flatlining, and nominal GDP now is still below the level it was back in 2008. But government debt's risen in the meantime. That's why they've reached the stage where their debt ratio exceeds 100% of GDP now. So Spain was doing everything right before the crisis. Now let's compare it now to a country that didn't have the Maastricht rules, the Eurozone. I know there's a huge size difference in comparing the two. But here's looking at the government debt to GDP ratios in the two countries. And there's the government debt to GDP ratio in Spain plunging all the way until the crisis hit and then exploding. The American debt to GDP ratio being below the Maastricht Treaty rule levels, but then cut right through it and rose quite substantially with 2013. Now the American ratio is flatlining or even falling, while the Spanish ratio continues to rise. So how are the Americans reducing their ratio? It's because their GDP is growing. Okay? So the direct attack that the Euro said you have to do on government spending ignores GDP, but the government spending may be a contributor to that GDP rising in the first place. So if you cut the numerator, which is the debt, it appears you're cutting the denominator even more. And I'll talk a bit about why that happens in lecture on austerity later on in the course. What you find is, looking at debt change now, so I'm looking at the change in debt and dividing that by GDP, you find that America throughout ran very large deficits compared to its GDP, bigger than Spain through most of the period. Now their deficits are back down, being quite low again, where the Spanish is still very high. Because they effectively focused on rescuing the economy first. They talked about reducing government spending. They had things like the sequester. Have you heard of the sequester? That was an attempt to use political gridlock in Washington to actually reduce government spending. Because the normal hassle in America is that you can't get anything changed through Congress, because of just so many political lobbyists and people won't vote the right way. So the Republicans passed a bill that would have meant that at a certain point in time government spending stopped and you couldn't change it. Okay? And that bill was basically thwarted. So they talked about austerity, they never actually brought it in. But they've been successful. And what you find is its debt ratio has stabilised because its GDP has continued growing. So here's the Spanish GDP again, graphed on the left-hand side, rising until the crisis and then falling. It's only just started to rise in the last year in nominal terms. The American GDP, graphed on the right-hand side, which is about 15 times the size, falls a bit, fairly sharply, and then continues rising again. So the Americans have reduced their government debt ratio by growing the denominator, GDP, rather than reducing the numerator, which is government spending. Now, so the Friedman and Godley belief about what's going to happen, that the euro would make the crisis worse, is true, but the question is what explains the crisis? Well, remember I talked about Minsky last week, and Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. What he argued was economic performance is driven primarily by what happens with private credit. And this is a quote from that Minsky lecture last week. The natural starting point for analysing the relation between debt and income is to take an economy with a cyclical past that's doing well. And he's starting right out by saying there is a relationship between debt and income. Now that's a radical proposition, not just amongst with conventional economists who ignore private debt. Even amongst my group of economists, I'm still trying to convince my non-orthodox people that Minsky is right. But I'll argue this in more detail in a couple of lectures' time. But a corollary of this analysis is that total demand and total income together both come from the turnover of existing money. It's already in circulation in the economy. So the money you've already got in your wallets, when you go buy a coffee and things like that, you're causing somebody else's income to rise when your expenditure is financed by out of your pocket. But also, if you go and swipe the credit card instead to buy that coffee, you increase your debt and you also increase your expenditure and you increase the income of the person you're buying that coffee from. They all go up simultaneously. So you have two sources of demand and income from turning over existing money, and demand and income from newly created money, which is mainly created by new private debt. When you look at the data, in England's term, for example, have you heard of a group called Positive Money? Anybody? Search on the web, Positive Money. Think about those terms. That's an English lobby group that's opposed to the monetary system we have right now and talking about reforming it in various ways. I don't agree with all their ideas, but I think they're worth having a good look at. And they point out that 97% of the money that's created in England now is created by private banks, not by the government. Now, we use pounds and shillings and pence and stuff like that, but obviously they're produced by the government. But primarily we're using your deposit accounts, and the money created there is created 97% of it by the banks themselves. So you get total demand and income, therefore, depend upon a relatively stable turnover of existing money. That does vary, but it's relatively stable. And a relatively volatile change in private debt. And you can add the two together. I'll explain the logic behind this again in future lectures, but you can add the two up to say total expenditure and total income and capital gain, combined together, are the sum of the GDP plus the change in debt. So looking at the US crisis, you can see there's a private debt bubble followed by a collapse in the rate of growth of that private debt. And that's really what triggered the crisis in America. To show you the data, you have a huge increase in private debt levels. So here's the USA and Spain graphed against each other, the level of private debt compared to GDP. Now, American data I'm taking right back to the beginning of the Second World War, and you can see the debt level was falling all the way through the Second World War for all sorts of reasons. The scale of government spending enabled private groups to pay their debt down, even though they've been paid a fortune to drop bombs on Germany or create bombs to drop on Germany. So the private sector's debt levels are falling all the way through. Then the war ended, and you have this rising level of private debt to GDP all the way through until the crisis hit. Spanish data have only got started in 1995, but look how fast their debt level rose. Now it was rising before the euro began. So you see a rise in private debt from 90% of GDP in 95 to about 110% in 2000, but it then exploded to 220% of GDP, and now it's falling. Now America, rising level of private debt until the crisis hit, and now it's falling as well, though it started to turn around. So this is the large part of the analysis I'll be taking you through in the next few lectures, why this matters. Now, when you look now at the rate of change of private debt, what I've got now is the change in private debt each year divided by GDP. And you can see America's change in debt in 1990 was about 10% of GDP. It plunged to almost zero in 1992, and that was a serious recession. Then it rose ever since till about 2006, and then it plunged, and between 2009 and 2011, Americans were actually reducing their debt, whether they were paying the debt down or they were going bankrupt. The level of private debt in America was actually falling. Spain had an enormous bubble. At one stage, the increase in private debt in 2007 was about 35% of GDP. Imagine your own personal situation. Let's say you earn £10,000 a year. Well, that's like taking out next to £3,500 in debt that year to buy something. Okay? It's a fairly substantial increase in debt. And so they then notice the crisis, which I date the crisis from August of 2007 because that's the date on which there was a big shock when a bank called BNP shut down 3 of its funds which were part of the American subprime market because they said they simply couldn't value the funds, so they shut them down. And that was the first really big shock that anybody got in the financial system. I think it's about August 9, 2007. Now from that you can see slightly before the crisis the rate of growth of private debt plunged in Spain. It recovered a bit until after austerity hit, and now the rate of reduction of private debt in Spain has been as high as almost 20% of GDP. So rather than increasing spending by 35% of your income each year, here they're reducing spending by 20% of GDP each year. They're rising a bit now, but there's still a massive reduction of money in circulation by people paying down the level of private debt. America, on the other hand, is having a rising level of debt. So you can see the crisis began when the rate of private debt slowed down, and there's much more severe deleveraging going on in Spain than there was in America. And I argue that a large part of why this deleveraging occurred was because, as well as the private sector taking money out of the economy, either the government wasn't injecting enough back in, or it was actually being forced to take money out as well by taxing people more, by spending less on welfare and so on. So when you look now, this is my argument's a heretical argument, not just amongst the conventional economists like neoclassicals, but also with a lot of my fellow post-Keynesians. But I want to show the strength of the argument behind the heresy, which is the correlation of the change in private debt with the level of unemployment. Now, according to conventional economics, there should be no correlation. Okay. Correlation coefficient there is minus 0.93. You've done correlation coefficients? Okay. So, unemployment, change in private debt rises, unemployment goes down. And basically the argument is, it's a causal argument, the extra private debt lets you employ more people. You borrow money, you hire people. Or people use credit cards to go shopping, you can afford to have more wait staff in the restaurant. What about Spain? I only graphed this one yesterday. I must admit I spent a bit of time in shock looking at that figure. Not because I was surprised by it, I am stunned. I mean, the correlation coefficient there between change in private debt in Spain and the level of unemployment is minus 0.97. You really can't get much closer to 1 than that with economic data, unless you're graphing x against x. Okay, it's just simply stunning, or x against minus x in this case. The fact that I've got to make this argument, I could use some strong language here, annoys the hell out of me because the data is so overwhelmingly powerful in favour of the argument that I'm making, that change in debt plays an essential role in demand in the economy. But you can see this period here of rising private debt and falling unemployment. I've turned unemployment upside down, by the way, so zero unemployment's up here and 30% unemployment is down here. So you can see unemployment in Spain fell from about 22% of the population to about 7.5% as private debt rose, and then when the rate of change of private debt slowed down, it doesn't need to turn negative, it just needs to slow down, unemployment started to rise again until you had 26% of the population unemployed. Now there's been a bit of a recovery, so private debt isn't falling as rapidly, and you notice that unemployment's also reduced. And that's statistically repeated for virtually every country in the world except one. You want to have a guess which country this doesn't apply to? Ahead of schedule? Any guesses? Come on. You guessed it a short while ago for the wrong reason.
Germany.
Yay! Okay. Germany will show you something different. Let's look at now government debt and unemployment. And here we find a positive correlation. Now, you've often heard the argument correlation is not causation. I can give you a causal argument for the role of the relationship between change in private debt and the level of unemployment. I want to imply one from this data, that unemployment causes change in government spending. If unemployment goes up, so does government spending. Fairly obvious reason. You've got to pay dole checks to people, and they're going to shop less and earn less money. So your tax revenue is going to go down. So in this case, I'd see unemployment is driving government spending. If you look at the United States, the correlation is 0.8. So unemployment going up, government spending rises, or the government deficit rises. Unemployment falls, government deficit goes down. In fact, you can run a surplus for a while, etc., etc. The whole pattern. So the causal process actually goes from private debt to unemployment, from unemployment to government spending. What about the situation in Spain? Spanish correlation is 0.9. It's like everything in Spain is stronger than everything in Europe, which I can appreciate since I definitely prefer Spanish food to American food. So what you get is this strong driving focus between change in debt, private debt, and unemployment and government spending. And what the European Union is doing is focusing on the symptom of the unemployment, not the cause. So the change in private debt is, I see, as the main driver of economic activity, and the reason is rising private debt reduces unemployment by both employing more people. Okay? Fundamentally, the change in private debt finances higher employment, so you get a negative correlation. But when the crisis hits, first of all, you've got rising private debt driving unemployment down. Then when the crisis hits, you have falling private debt driving unemployment up. And that's what we saw in 2008 across the planet. And then the level of unemployment drives government spending. So falling unemployment means a falling government deficit. Rising unemployment means a rising government deficit. And that's the way you get the positive correlation in that situation. So what the Maastricht Treaty is doing is preventing that rise in the government spending, which means that because of the Maastricht Treaty, when a crisis hits, private organisations and households have less money in their pockets to repay those debts than they would have otherwise. So with less money in their pockets, they're going to spend less, and they're going to go bankrupt. All these factors will keep you depressed. My basic analogy is, you want to think about how the government relates to the private sector. Imagine the private sector is a room, and the government's an air conditioning system. What happens with an air conditioning system? If the temperature rises in the room, the air conditioning system pumps in cold air. Okay? If the temperature falls in the room, it pumps in warm air. It works in the opposite direction to keep you balanced. So by not having that thinking about the government, by seeing the government as a bad thing necessarily, which is the European Union attitude, it's like you're in a room where when the temperature falls, the air conditioning system goes cold. And that's the real danger. It's actually it's made the drop in temperature inside the economic room in that sense more extreme than it would be without the Maastricht Treaty. Now, Italy, I find an intriguing example because it's allowed to get away with so much compared to what they let Greece get away with. So there's the level of private debt in Italy, and it's a lot lower. It starts at about 70% of GDP before the crisis, before the euro comes in, pardon me. It then reaches a peak of about 130%, which is well below the level for America and also, of course, for Spain. But you have this rate of change, the same basic story. It maxes out slightly after the crisis begins, pardon me. Then the rate of change of private debt trends down, bounces up a bit, then it's negative. So there's deleveraging, private sector deleveraging going on in Italy as well. And when you look at the correlation between the change in private debt and the level of unemployment, even though it's a lower level of debt, you've still got a moderately strong correlation there, minus 0.73, nothing like the minus 9.9 I was finding for America and for Spain with a much higher level of private debt, but still pretty strong. And then looking now at the correlation of unemployment and change in government spending, same basic story. The unemployment's driving government spending in Italy, which is why government spending, the change in Italian private government debt, is running at about 15% of GDP. Now, that might also be why Italy has not gone into as deep a recession as Spain and Greece have done, because it's being allowed to get away with that level of government spending. Now, partly it's financing that by selling bonds, so it's not out of the woods by any means, but I think Italy is going to face a crunch at some point, given those dynamics too. Now, so Schäuble's argument, Schäuble, said that as in medicine, to get the right treatment, it's essential to have the correct diagnosis. And I think it's screamingly obvious, his diagnosis was incorrect. Private debt is the issue that drove the whole boom and bust beforehand. That's what caused the crisis. And you've got rising debt before the crisis causing a rising ratio of debt to GDP, private debt. The boom became a slump when the rate of growth of private debt slowed down. What do you think of private debt was financing predominantly, by the way, in Spain? Pardon? Housing, a huge building boom. Again, a bit like London in that sense. A massive speculative bubble on real estate. Ireland? Same. Pardon? Housing, same sort of story. It was a housing bubble, and we'll talk a bit about the dynamics of that again in a later lecture. Now, in the USA, same sort of story applied, but there was responsive government spending, which slowed down the rate at which the private sector was deleveraging. It meant people didn't necessarily go bankrupt, or without the government spending they may well have gone bankrupt, and therefore reduced private debt. Okay. But what it meant was, once the government spending came in, the private sector was encouraged to go back to borrowing money again, and that borrowing stimulated demand. So you've got a recovery again in America right now, but it's from a much higher level of private debt, and they're still ignoring the private debt level. If you look at the Federal Reserve, just by accident, 3 or 4 weeks ago, published its economic model. By accident. Yeah, I don't know how they sent out an email to someone that gave them a link that let them download the entire model they put together, which is supposed to be secret. A place called Zero Hedge published it on the web. Of course, I downloaded a copy straight away. Again, it looks unintelligible if you're not used to reading economic models. Devram could read it because he actually built models like that. And I can read it too, not as well as Devram. But when you look at the model, there's absolutely no role for private debt finance spending. There's no argument inside the model for government for private debt. And all the decisions they're making about whether to put rates up again are ignoring private debt levels in America. So in the European, nonetheless, having said that, the Americans did stimulate the economy by government spending, whereas in the European Union, they weren't allowed to do it, so you've got a continuing slump. And effectively, you're creating a depression by enforcing austerity. Now, Germany, of course, is the exception. Why is Germany different? Well, its private debt actually fell. The red line is the ratio of private debt to GDP in Germany. It rose a bit towards the middle of the 2000s, but then from 2003 on, it's been falling. And if you look at the change in private debt, that's actually been negative here, then positive, then negative, so back to positive again right now. But they've been deleveraging quite frequently. But that deleveraging hasn't gone with a massive increase in unemployment. In fact, unemployment's been falling. So you find a correlation between change in private debt and the level of unemployment, but it's very tiny, only minus 0.02. Nothing to write home about. What's the R squared on that? You know? It's 0.04, very tiny R squared. But that you can ignore. It's a trivial contributor. What do you think is financing German employment? If it's not change in private debt, and it's not government spending, what's financing their employment level? I guess. If it's not private debt that's financing their employment levels, and it's not government spending, what do you think is providing the finance that lets them employ so many people? Pardon? Taxes? No. Exports. Okay. They're exporting to the rest of the world. They're running a trade surplus of 7.5% of GDP, which is far higher than the government deficit allowed by the Maastricht Treaty. Now you look at unemployment and government debt change, you find effectively no relationship, 0.08. You'd never even bother reporting that. Okay, so there's no impact again on the Germans of change in unemployment on government spending. Again, because they've got a booming economy and the money's been provided by their export surplus, not by what's happening domestically. So it's got a trade surplus of the order of 5 to 7% of GDP at the moment, which is a gigantic trade surplus. It's a bigger trade surplus as a percentage of its economy than the trade deficit that England has with the rest of the world. And also, one thing about Germany which is really important, what's one thing they obviously haven't had? Pardon? Haven't had a housing bubble, yeah. Any idea why? Pardon? Lower rents? Yeah.
They all rent.
Pardon?
They all rent.
They all rent. You know why? Well, rent's really... If you take out a rental contract in England, how long do you... Who's renting here? Okay, how long is your lease? Pardon? A year, okay. The average lease in Germany is so long that one of the normal conditions on a lease is that the lessee has to provide a new kitchen. Okay? I still can't quite comprehend that, but I've been told by German friends, if you're a tenant, when you move into a new apartment, you provide the kitchen. Okay? The kitchen gets stripped out by the previous tenant or whatever, and the kitchen's your contribution. So you're going to be living in the place long enough to get the value of putting in a kitchen. Can you imagine? So with that sort of situation, who feels the pressure to move out? Because at a rental level, you can actually put a new kitchen in. So a huge motivation for people in English countries, and I know this from Australia as well, huge motivation to buy a property is because you get sick and tired of being pushed around by a landlord. Or kicked out with 6 months' notice and things like that, or 6 weeks' notice. In Germany, that can't happen. So there's not the same pressure on you to get a mortgage, and therefore they all rent. And they live fairly comfortably. So if you take a look now at the private debt levels and you break it down into household debt and business debt, you find business debt has fluctuated up and down about the 50% of GDP level, but all the way through, household debt's actually been falling. So there's some things Germany does that are very sensible, which could be replicated. Having that sort of arrangement, the level of power for lessors against landlords, or lessees against it. Lessees or lessors? Lessees, I think. I get my Latin terms mixed up. So the question often is, why can't the rest of the world be like Germany? Well, we could borrow things like their mortgage rules and their rental rules and stuff like that. But we can't borrow their trade surplus. We can't all run a trade surplus of 7% of GDP. The simple reason being the net total of all exports in the world minus imports is zero. Okay. If you export from Germany, somebody else has got to import exactly that amount, and vice versa. So it's a zero-sum game. So if Germany's running a trade surplus of 7% of its GDP, when you add up all the trade deficits everybody else has with Germany, they've got a trade deficit of 7% of GDP. So it's simply not possible. The only thing we can do is get the Germans to behave less like the Germans, get them back to a trade balance, and then we could all behave like Germany. But while Germany tries to run this huge trade surplus and won't even consider talking about reducing it, we can't match them. In fact, it looks like a seesaw. You basically have, Merkel telling Cyprus, why can't you be like us? Why can't you earn a surplus? And he answers, well, because you earn a surplus? It's a seesaw. And that's what the Germans are ignoring. They are able to do what they can because they've got a huge trade surplus. If we had a system which eliminated trade surpluses, then the rest of the world could be like Germany, but we'd all be on the same level. And what happens, of course, is we have financial flows. But if you like this cartoon, okay, the guy who does it is now called Miguel Guerra, and Miguel's cartoons are published on this website. So he also has a whole range of cartoons, a superhero series, and a whole lot of other stuff, but rather countercultural stuff. So do take a look at that. So that's why we can't be like Europe. So what's likely to happen? Well, you've got a Great Depression going on in southern Europe. Spain and Greece definitely. What's happening in Croatia, which is trying to join up, a very, very similar thing. People are depopulating whole towns there. I actually drove from Zagreb down to a coastal town in Croatia, and my driver casually mentioned that this town was now pretty much zero population. I said, where are the people going? So they're all looking for jobs in Germany and Austria, and the movement rules let them make that move. So the towns are becoming empty. In one ironic way, that could be a form of solution for the refugee crisis, because there are plenty of empty towns in the south of Europe, courtesy of this mad policy. Now, the Troika's obviously unwilling to change its policy. Its treatment of Greece, I think, was brutal. There's no other way to describe how they treated them. But at the same time, most EU countries are unwilling to leave the euro because they're afraid of the transition costs of doing that. So they're locked in that sense. I know Yanis Varoufakis and I disagree over this one. Yanis thought he simply couldn't bargain to leave the euro and didn't think anybody should try to leave the euro. And I said, look, if you're in a relationship where you're being bashed by your spouse and you say, I'm going to try to resolve this and change your behaviour without moving out, what happens? Okay? So you really have to say you need a credible threat of somebody wanting to leave before you're likely to change what happens in the euro. And the only credible threats I can see, possibly Spain, but Italy and France could credibly threaten to leave. And there's now one of the politicians in Italy, who's actually a comedian by original training, he's now said we should leave the euro. So there's some possibility of that sort of big flip coming out of it. Now, you might try to reform internally, but Garner's made this wonderful comment. He said he'd make a detailed economic argument about why the euro was unfailing, way to change the institutions and change the rules. Talking to his other finance ministers, he said, when I finished, I might as well have been singing the Swedish national anthem. They just basically ignored what he had to say and went on saying, okay, how do we now impose these rules on you? Completely ignored his argument. He said, it's as if no one had even spoken. So there's no openness to debate, no openness to discussion inside the euro. So my feeling is the likely outcome is a continued depression in the south of the country. The only way that they can recover is by having a huge trade surplus. And since they can't devalue for that trade surplus, the only way it's happening is by cutting wages and cutting prices, as you saw when you were... Which country did you go to? Spain. Okay. Everything's getting cheaper over there because people are being paid less. Of course, they're being paid less, but they've still got the same debts, which is meaning they're going bankrupt. So it's part of the whole chain reaction. So living standards have to fall. The only way the EU policy can work is if living standards continue falling in the south of Europe. So the success of the policy is based on a failure of maintaining living standards. And I think what's likely to break it is some extreme political shift, not just somebody like Syriza being elected, but somebody with a rather more brutal approach to politics, which is exactly what happened in the 1930s, at that time in Germany. Okay. Any questions after all that? Let's have a good chat tomorrow. Have you taken a look at the reference I mentioned to read for